has to be defined by, movements within the history of the city and my own personal kind of physical movements, my evolution as a person. So let me try and make sense of it from a series of vantage points. The first vantage point I'll offer is, by the way, I was born in Calcutta in 1962, and then my parents moved to Bombay, and then after that we would periodically visit Calcutta. But before describing the axes of Bombay and Calcutta for me, as a way of defining the city and my relationship with it, I want to talk about Calcutta and New York for a second. In 1979, I went to America for the first time. My first stop was my cousin's place in San Diego. And I remember...
in San Diego?
In San Diego.
So you went...
So I first went to California. And went to spend some time with my cousin, me and my mother, at San Diego. It was, I suppose, my first encounter with the American suburb where he was staying. I was struck by an orderliness and prettiness that I'd never seen before, and I could not figure out why I was so depressed. And the next stop was New York. It was disorderly and it was noxious in many ways, the atmosphere. But it revived me as if I had suddenly breathed in a kind of oxygen. This oxygen I identify as the oxygen of the contradictoriness of what I call modernity, where you encounter a decaying industrial city which is also new, simultaneously embodies the new, but it is also historical. And my understanding and education in modernity and why I reacted to New York in the way I did comes from Calcutta, my encounter with Calcutta, and my addiction through Calcutta to modernity, which became a kind of oxygen which I would go out trying to sniff out in places. So that's that point at which New York was still not packaged. In fact, it was not in boom time. It was doing badly economically. Paradoxically, it was vibrant, unlike the wealthier San Diego. That moment was a moment of change. Gradually in about 10 years or so, the Berlin Wall would collapse, things would become quite different. Calcutta would become different, New York would become different. But that moment defined for me what my predilections were, how Calcutta had formed me in deciding what my predilections were. That's one axis. The other thing I would say is my unhappiness growing up in Bombay, where I was growing up, I have to say, in Indira Gandhi's regime. So I was growing up in upper middle class kind of, in an upper middle class milieu. My father was a corporate man. I was growing up in Malabar Hill, but yet it was a mixed economy, and so wildly different from the free kind of circulation of capital today. So my father was heavily taxed, and we knew that the flat we occupied was not ours. We would have to vacate it. But a completely different form of life awaited me on every visit to Calcutta at my uncle's house in Bhawanipur. My uncle came from the same place as my father did. This is my mother's brother, Sylhet. But he had become a businessman and was running a failing business. And yet there was this same paradoxical vibrancy in that area, in Pratapaditya Road and in my uncle's life. And it was a cosmopolitan vibrancy. That means he had a very eclectic range of reference in his life. And so did his children, including the children's book they read. One thing that those visits taught me is that there was an alternative in terms of middle class existence to an existence that was defined either by a notion of wealth or by English or a kind of nationalistic alternative to do with Hindi. That there was this cosmopolitan space that belonged to another language, Bengali, which was neither English nor Hindi, Here in Bombay, the kind of life we led at that time meant that in a way that was not possible in Calcutta. There was a schism with the life in Malabar Hill with the life in Dadar. Now, if I had been connected with the life in Dadar, if there was a way for our lot to be connected with that life in Dadar, maybe I would have been exposed to another space which I could only find in Calcutta, where there was no such schism to that in a comparable way. There was absolutely no such schism. So I think Calcutta's achievement was to create a linguistic and cultural space which was alternative to English, which was cosmopolitan and modern, and not a cultural nationalist space. So Bengali didn't come to me in the guise of cultural nationalism. So people who were speaking Bengali were not saying that we are proclaiming our identity through Bengali. They were proclaiming a range of references according to which they identified themselves as moderns. I think that is a very important lesson, which I did not get in Bombay.
You know, just listening to you, it's so interesting because it seems to me that it's as though even when we're living in the same city, we live in different cities, because that person that you're imagining in Dadar would have had a very different experience of Bombay. And there may be people living in the more anglicized or westernized sections of Kolkata, like maybe Park Street, who would have experienced the same schism that you experienced in Bombay when you were growing up.
But no, I don't think it would have been the same. No, that's the
not
point.
The same. Not the same.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I think. I mean, since you bring this point up, can I say why I don't feel it's the same? Because the figure of and I'm not discounting the experiences of people outside of this group I'm talking about, whether these are upper class people or working class people. But I'm looking at this very interesting singular kind of appearance of this Bhadralok or middle class figure, and the middle class has two words for it in Bangla: Madhyabitta, person of moderate means, and Bhadralok, civil society or whatever. But interestingly, this middle class person who speaks English as a second language but knows, the Greek philosophers, it's an interesting mix. He speaks in his mother tongue, speaks English as a second language, and wears dhuti and Punjabi. But not proclaiming through dhuti and Punjabi native identity. So when you see, if you were to see in the 40s a man like Buddhadev Bose coming towards dhuti and Punjabi, you would know that this is a person who has this range of references. The Ingo Bongo, the people who are westernized and appear in suits in Bengal, do not have that same range of cultural reference. And they do not form a hegemony in Bengal. The hegemony is created by people who speak English as a second language, but are perhaps more intimate with this literature than the Ingo Bongo people, who speak English perfectly, use cutlery, are very westernized in a conventional sense. So the whole question of what is westernization, what it means to a modern, I think is complicated by this person in a dhuti Punjabi in the 20th century, from late 19th century onwards, in a way that's very interesting. We can critique this person, but first we have to know what this person is all about.
Right, and you feel that that person is unique to Kolkata?
I think so, yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the funny things is that, in Bombay, what I find very striking is that Bombay, I've been to Bombay now several times because